war cinema operates under a burden that no other genre carries: the obligation to render something real. These are not invented monsters or fictional conspiracies. They are events that happened, to people who existed, in places that still exist. The best war films understand that their subject matter demands a specific kind of honesty, and that spectacle without that honesty is not cinema, but exploitation. These are our picks for the 20 best war films ever made, a list that crosses continents, decades, and conflicts, and that we suspect will generate more argument than almost anything else we have ranked. Number 20, Fury, 2014. David Ayer's film is set in the final weeks of the Second World War in Europe, following the crew of an American Sherman tank named Fury as they push into Germany in April 1945. Brad Pitt plays the tank commander, Don War Daddy Collier, with a weary authority that anchors the film's more operatic sequences. Logan Lerman plays the new crew member, whose inexperience provides the audience with its entry point into a world of comprehensive violence. Shia LaBeouf, Michael Pena, and John Bernthal complete a crew of impressive internal differentiation. The film earns its place on this list through its commitment to the physical reality of armored warfare, the claustrophobia of the tank interior, the particular terror of anti-tank fire, the way that crew survival depends on a coordination that has to function faster than conscious thought. The weakness is a structural middle section involving a German apartment and two women that slows the film's momentum without adding the moral complexity it appears to be reaching for. Ayer wants Fury to be more than a war film, and occasionally loses the thread of the war film he has actually made. At its best, however, particularly in the final tank engagement, it is extraordinary. Number 19, The Hurt Locker, 2008. Catherine Bigelow's film won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, making Bigelow the first woman to win the latter, and it deserved both, not because it is the most comprehensive statement on the Iraq War, but because it is the most honest examination of the specific psychology that the Iraq War produced in the soldiers who fought it. Jeremy Renner plays Staff Sergeant William James, a bomb disposal technician who is, in the film's opening line, either an adrenaline junkie or a man who has found the one environment in which his particular brand of recklessness becomes a professional asset. The film is structured as a series of disposal operations, rather than a conventional narrative arc, which means it builds tension laterally. Each sequence is independent. Each carries full weight, and this formal decision makes the cumulative effect more devastating than a single climax would have been. Anthony Mackie plays James's team partner, with a controlled anxiety that functions as the film's moral compass. The weakness is a domestic interlude near the film's conclusion that briefly loses the formal rigor of everything that preceded it. But The Hurt Locker's depiction of addiction to danger, not glorification of it but clinical examination of it, remains unsurpassed. Number 18, Black Hawk Down, 2001. Ridley Scott's film reconstructs the Battle of Mogadishu in October 1993, in which a U.S. Army Ranger operation to capture lieutenants of Somali warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid descended into an 18-hour urban battle following the downing of 2 Black Hawk helicopters. Josh Hartnett leads an ensemble that includes Ewan McGregor, Tom Sizemore, Eric Bana, and Sam Shepard, none of whom are the film's real protagonist. The protagonist is the operation itself, and Scott's direction makes that structural choice feel not like an absence of character, but like the correct representation of a combat situation in which individual identity becomes temporarily subordinate to collective survival. The film's action sequences are choreographed with a clarity that is unusual for urban combat cinema. At any given moment, you know where you are, relative to the objective, who is in danger, and what the stakes of each decision are. The weakness is a tendency to present the Somali combatants as an undifferentiated force, rather than as individuals with their own perspectives on the same event, which gives the film an inadvertent narrowness that a more ambitious production might have addressed. But as a portrait of military discipline under catastrophic pressure, Black Hawk Down has not been equaled. Number 17, Glory, 1989. Edward Zwick's film tells the story of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first formal African-American units in the United States Army, commanded by the young Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, played by Matthew Broderick. Denzel Washington plays a freed black man who enlists, resists, and eventually commits, and won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in a performance that remains one of the most precisely calibrated studies of pride, humiliation, and evolving loyalty in American cinema. Morgan Freeman plays the regiment's sergeant major with a gravity that the film's more sentimental passages do not always deserve. Glory belongs on this list not only for its battle sequences, which culminate in the assault on Fort Wagner, with a ferocity and an emotional weight that the film has fully earned, but for what it says about the specific additional burden carried by soldiers fighting for a country that has not yet decided to extend its stated principles to them. The weakness is Broderick, whose Shaw is more observer than protagonist, competent and earnest, but rarely as compelling as the men he commands. This is arguably the correct dramatic choice, but it leaves the film occasionally more admirable than involving. Number 16, All Quiet on the Western Front. 2022. Edward Berger's German-language remake of Erich Maria Remarque's novel won 4 Academy Awards, including Best International Feature Film, and distinguishes itself from both the 1930 original and the source novel by stripping the narrative of almost all sentiment and leaving only the machinery of attrition. Felix Kammerer plays Paul Bäumer, a young German soldier who enlists in the First World War with enthusiasm and discovers, across the course of the film, that enthusiasm is the first casualty of the trenches. The film's formal decision to intercut the Western Front with the diplomatic negotiations at Compiègne that would eventually produce the armistice generates a dramatic irony so precise as to be almost unbearable, particularly in the film's final sequence. The weakness is that Berger's determination to achieve bleakness at every available opportunity occasionally tips into aesthetic repetition. The mud, the wire, the mechanized slaughter are rendered with such consistency that the film's emotional register can feel static despite the physical horror on screen. But the final scene, occurring in the 11 minutes between the signing of the armistice and its coming into effect, is one of the most devastating passages in recent war cinema. Number 15, Dunkirk, 2017. Christopher Nolan's film treats the evacuation of 338,000 Allied soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk in May and June 1940. Not as a historical narrative, but as a sensory experience, and in doing so produces something that functions less like a conventional war film than like a sustained physiological event. The film operates across 3 timelines of different durations: a week on the beach, a day at sea, an hour in the air, which converge toward the same moment from different temporal distances. And Nolan's management of this structure is the film's central technical achievement. Fionn Whitehead plays a young soldier on the beach. Mark Rylance plays a civilian sailor crossing the channel. Tom Hardy plays a Spitfire pilot whose fuel gauge provides the film's most precise dramatic mechanism. The weakness is that Nolan's commitment to experiential immersion comes at the cost of character depth. These are figures in a situation rather than fully inhabited people, and some viewers have found the film's emotional detachment frustrating rather than purposeful. Hans Zimmer's score, built on a shepherd tone that creates the illusion of endlessly ascending tension, is one of the most effective pieces of film music of the past decade. Number 14, Letters from Iwo Jima, 2006. Clint Eastwood made 2 films about the Battle of Iwo Jima simultaneously, Flags of Our Fathers from the American perspective, and this from the Japanese. And this is the better film, in part because the American perspective on the Second World War has been extensively represented in cinema, and in part because Eastwood's formal decision to adopt the Japanese soldier's point of view produces a film of unusual moral complexity. Ken Watanabe plays General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander who understands that his orders are a death sentence for every man on the island and chooses to honor those orders anyway. a portrait of institutional loyalty operating in the complete absence of strategic hope. Kazunari Ninomiya plays a young baker who enlisted involuntarily and whose letters home provide the film's emotional through line. The film's central achievement is making the audience understand, without endorsing, the worldview that produced this particular form of military sacrifice. The weakness is an unevenness of tone in its middle section, where some sequences achieve the film's intended register more fully than others. But Letters from Iwo Jima remains the most morally rigorous studio war film made in America in the 21st century. Number 13, Hacksaw Ridge, 2016. Mel Gibson's film tells the true story of Desmond Doss, the first conscientious objector to be awarded the Medal of Honor, who served as a combat medic in the Second World War and refused on religious grounds to carry a weapon, and who, on the escarpment at Hacksaw Ridge in Okinawa in 1945, carried 75 wounded men to safety single-handedly over a single night. Andrew Garfield plays Doss with a sincerity that the role demands and that the film earns through the patience of its first act, which establishes the faith and the stubbornness that will later sustain the character through circumstances that would break a less committed man. The film's battle sequences are among the most viscerally effective in recent war cinema. Gibson shoots violence with an unflinching specificity that his critics have long accused of being gratuitous, and his defenders argue is the only honest alternative to sanitization. The weakness is a first act that occasionally tips from sincere into earnest in ways that the film's more sophisticated second half does not quite redeem. But the central sequence, Doss alone on the ridge, lowering man after man through the darkness, repeating a single prayer, is one of the most emotionally overwhelming passages in contemporary war cinema. Number 12, The Deer Hunter, 1978. Michael Cimino's film won 5 Academy Awards and is among the most debated in American cinema, both for the power of its central sequences and for the historical controversy surrounding its depiction of the Viet Cong, which several critics have argued is deeply unfair. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage play steelworkers from a Pennsylvania mill town who go to Vietnam as friends and return, those who return, as something considerably more complicated. The Russian roulette sequences, which the film deploys as its central metaphor for the specific randomness of the Vietnam War's violence, are among the most sustained pieces of dramatic tension in American cinema, and Walken's Academy Award-winning performance in those sequences communicates a disintegration so complete that the film's final hour feels like an act of mourning rather than resolution. Meryl Streep appears in her breakthrough role. The weakness is a first act that runs to nearly an hour. The steel town, the wedding, the hunting trip, which is deliberately paced and essential to what follows, but which has frustrated audiences since 1978. We would argue that patience is precisely what The Deer Hunter requires and rewards. Number 11, Platoon, 1986. Oliver Stone served in Vietnam before making this film, and the specific knowledge that produces the smell, the hierarchy, the particular moral disorientation of fighting a war whose purpose remained opaque to many of the people fighting it, is the quality that distinguishes Platoon from the war films that preceded it. Charlie Sheen plays a young volunteer who arrives in Vietnam in 1967 with a romanticized notion of combat and finds himself in an infantry platoon divided between 2 sergeants, played by Tom Berenger and Willem Dafoe, whose conflict maps precisely onto the film's central moral argument. The My Lai adjacent village sequence remains one of the most uncomfortable passages in American war cinema. Stone films it without musical score, without dramatic punctuation, in a register that implicates the viewer in the atrocity rather than positioning them comfortably outside it. The weakness is the film's use of Sheen's character as an explicitly allegorical figure. His voiceover occasionally tells us what the film is already showing, which edges toward the didactic. But Platoon's core argument, that the enemy in Vietnam was sometimes the man standing beside you, was genuinely radical in 1986 and has not lost its force. Number 10, The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. David Lean's film won 7 Academy Awards and established the war epic as a legitimate vehicle for serious moral inquiry, at a moment when war cinema was still primarily a genre of heroic simplification. Alec Guinness plays Colonel Nicholson, a British officer who, having successfully resisted the Japanese camp commandant's demand that officers perform manual labor, then redirects his stubbornness into building the very bridge the Japanese require, an act whose logic becomes so internally consistent that the film can observe it with fascination and horror simultaneously. William Holden plays an American prisoner of war whose escape and subsequent mission back to the bridge provides the film's action architecture. The film's central question, whether Nicholson is a hero of principle or a collaborator, is never cleanly resolved, and the final line spoken by the camp doctor watching the catastrophe at the bridge is the most carefully placed piece of dialogue in war cinema. The weakness is a pacing that reflects the conventions of its era. The film is long and deliberate and rewards patience more than urgency. But Guinness's performance remains the finest study of institutional rigidity in the entire genre. Number 9. The Thin Red Line, 1998. Terrence Malick's film arrived the same year as Saving Private Ryan and was immediately overshadowed by it, which is understandable and unfortunate in roughly equal measure. The two films are so different in their approach to the same subject that comparing them is less useful than recognizing they are not competing for the same thing. Where Spielberg asked what combat costs the body, Malick asks what it costs the soul, and the question produces a film of extraordinary formal beauty and unusual philosophical ambition. Jim Caviezel plays a soldier who has gone absent without leave and hidden among the indigenous people of Guadalcanal. Sean Penn plays a sergeant of bleak pragmatism. Nick Nolte plays a general whose ambition is indistinguishable from his military purpose. The film's voiceover, multiple, overlapping, sometimes unattributed, functions less as narrative commentary than as a sustained meditation on the relationship between violence and the natural world. The weakness is that Malick's formal approach, which places the contemplative above the dramatic, will lose viewers who arrived expecting the clarity of a conventional war narrative. We would argue that is not a weakness, but a feature. The Thin Red Line is the most beautiful war film ever made. Number 8. Lawrence of Arabia, 1962. David Lean's second appearance on this list is for a film whose claim to the war genre is broader and more contested than The Bridge on the River Kwai's. This is a film about the Arab Revolt of 1916 to 1918 and the British officer who helped coordinate it. And it is as much a psychological portrait and a study of colonial ambiguity as it is a war film. But T.E. Lawrence's story is inseparable from the conflict that produced it, and the film's depiction of desert warfare, the attack on Aqaba, the massacre at Tafas, earns its place in any serious account of what war cinema can do. Peter O'Toole's Lawrence is one of the most complex protagonists in Hollywood history. Charismatic, masochistic, politically duplicitous, and finally broken by the gap between the liberation he promised and the colonial settlement he helped deliver. Omar Sharif plays Sheriff Ali with a warmth that provides the film with its emotional center. The weakness is a length, at nearly 4 hours, that requires a commitment most contemporary viewers will find demanding. The reward for that commitment is a film that has not been equaled in its treatment of the relationship between individual mythology and institutional betrayal. Number 7. Das Boot, 1981. Wolfgang Petersen's film, running in its director's cut to nearly 5 hours, though most cinema releases show a version of approximately 2.5, is the definitive depiction of submarine warfare and one of the most claustrophobic films ever made. Jürgen Prochnow plays the captain of a German U-boat on patrol in the Atlantic in 1941, and the film's formal decision to confine almost the entire action to the submarine's interior means that the tension it generates is not the tension of battle, but the tension of enclosure, of waiting, of machinery and water, and the knowledge that the distance between survival and catastrophe is measured in millimeters of steel. The crew are not political. The film is careful to distinguish between their professional purpose and any ideological investment in the regime that sent them, which makes the moral texture of watching them considerably more complex than conventional war film conventions allow. Herbert Grönemeyer plays a war correspondent whose civilian perspective mirrors the audience's own. The weakness is that the director's cut, while more comprehensive, occasionally loses momentum in its middle section. But the depth charge sequences, heard before they are felt, felt before they are survived, remain the most effectively rendered combat tension in cinema history. Number 6, 1917. 2019. Sam Mendes and cinematographer Roger Deakins constructed this film as a single continuous shot, or rather as the illusion of a single continuous shot, achieved through meticulous planning and digital stitching that is itself an extraordinary technical achievement. And the formal decision is not a gimmick, but a statement that the First World War cannot be comprehended in fragments, that the only honest way to represent a message that must be delivered now, across no man's land, past every available form of death, is to follow it without cutting away. George Mackay and Dean Charles Chapman play two young British lance corporals, given the mission to cross enemy territory and deliver orders to a battalion about to walk into a trap. The film does not ask you to care about the larger strategic picture. It asks you to care whether these two men continue to exist in the next 5 minutes, and it does so with a sustained technical and emotional precision that very few films of any genre achieve. The weakness is that the formal achievement occasionally draws attention to itself. There are seams visible in the single-take illusion that briefly remind you of the construction rather than the content. Roger Deakins won the Academy Award for cinematography. It was deserved. Number 5. Full Metal Jacket. 1987. Stanley Kubrick's film is divided into two halves, so formally distinct that they almost constitute separate films. And in the tension between those halves lies the argument Kubrick is making about war, about the military institution, and about what it costs a human being to become the kind of soldier war requires. The first half, set at Parris Island Marine Corps boot camp, is the most precise dramatization of institutional dehumanization in American cinema. R. Lee Ermey plays Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, a performance that Ermey, an actual former drill instructor, largely improvised, with a ferocity that is simultaneously comic and terrifying, and the film watches with apparent neutrality as Private Pyle, played by Vincent D'Onofrio, is systematically broken, and then, in the film's hinge sequence, reassembled into something capable of violence. The second half, set during the Tet Offensive in Hue, is formally cooler and more conventional, and Kubrick's critics have argued it is the lesser half. We would disagree. The final sniper sequence, in which the platoon is pinned down by a single teenage girl, is the film's most precise statement about what the Vietnam War actually produced. Soldiers who have been made into killers, confronted with the specific human cost of what they have become. Number 4. Come and See. 1985. Elem Klimov's Soviet film is the most disturbing war film ever made, and we mean that not as hyperbole, but as a formal description of its effect. It follows Flyora, a Belarusian teenager who joins the Soviet resistance in 1943 and witnesses, over the course of the film, the systematic massacre of Belarusian civilians by Nazi forces. And the film's central formal decision is to remain in close proximity to Flyora's face throughout, so that the atrocities he witnesses are registered through his physical transformation rather than depicted directly. Alexei Kravchenko plays Flyora and was required during production to actually experience many of the film's conditions. The shelling sequences used live ammunition, and Kravchenko's shock is not performance. The film visibly aged Kravchenko during production, which the camera records. Come and See is rarely discussed in the same conversation as Saving Private Ryan or Apocalypse Now. It is a Soviet film, largely unavailable for decades, still not widely seen. And this relative obscurity is one of the more significant failures of Western film culture. The weakness, if one must be named, is that the film's unrelenting register makes it practically unwatchable in the conventional sense. This is precisely the point. It is not a film about war. It is war. Number 3. Paths of Glory. 1957. Stanley Kubrick was 29 years old when he made this film, and it remains across a career that includes 2001, The Shining, and Full Metal Jacket, his most formally perfect. Kirk Douglas plays Colonel Dax, a French officer in the First World War who, following a suicidal assault ordered by generals unwilling to risk their own careers on a realistic assessment of what the assault could achieve, defends 3 soldiers chosen by lottery to be court-martialed and executed for cowardice, as a lesson to the troops. The film's argument is not that war is hell, but that the men who direct war from safety are something more specifically condemnable than its victims. And it makes that argument with the precision of mise-en-scène, the wide-angle tracking shots through the trenches, the geometry of the courtroom, that demonstrates the relationship between formal control and moral clarity. Adolphe Menjou and George Macready play the generals with a civilized corruption that is more disturbing than outright villainy. The weakness is a final sequence that Kubrick himself considered extraneous, though subsequent critical consensus has rehabilitated it. Paths of Glory was banned in France for 18 years for its portrayal of the French military. There is no greater endorsement. Number 2, Saving Private Ryan. 1998. Steven Spielberg's film begins with 27 minutes that changed war cinema permanently. The Omaha Beach landing sequence, shot with handheld cameras, desaturated color, and a deliberate refusal of the formal conventions that had previously allowed audiences to watch combat at a safe aesthetic distance. The sequence has been used in military training. Veterans of the Normandy landings have described it as the most accurate representation of their experience they have encountered. Spielberg and cinematographer Janusz Kaminski achieved this not through documentary fidelity, but through formal choices that overwhelm the viewer's critical detachment. The camera moves with the soldiers rather than observing them. The editing refuses rhythm. The sound design positions the viewer inside the experience rather than beside it. Tom Hanks plays Captain John Miller with a controlled authority that gradually reveals its own cost. His shaking hand, the private conversations that cost him something to have. Matt Damon plays Private Ryan with a simplicity that the role requires. The weakness is a framing device, the elderly veteran at the cemetery, that Spielberg has been accused of sentimentalizing, and the accusation is not entirely unfounded. But the Omaha Beach sequence alone would be sufficient to place this film near the top of any serious account of what war cinema can do. That the film sustains that standard for much of its remaining running time is the achievement. Number 1. Apocalypse Now. 1979. Francis Ford. Coppola's film was famously difficult to make. The production ran over schedule and over budget in the Philippines. Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack. Marlon Brando arrived without having read the source material, and Coppola himself came close to psychological collapse. And the film that emerged carries the weight of its own creation in a way that very few films do. Martin Sheen plays Captain Willard, a special forces officer sent upriver into Cambodia to assassinate Colonel Kurtz, played by Brando, a Green Beret who has gone rogue and established himself as a god among a tribe of indigenous people. The film uses Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as its structural foundation and Vietnam as its moral landscape. And the journey upriver functions as a descent into a version of America that the war has made visible. The napalm aestheticism of Kilgore, played by Robert Duvall in the finest supporting performance in the film, the USO show in the jungle, the Du Lung Bridge held by no one. Brando's Kurtz, when he finally appears, is less a character than a destination, the logical endpoint of a system of violence that the film has been documenting for 2 hours. The weakness is an ending that Coppola has cut and recut across multiple versions, and that still divides audiences. We would argue that the ambiguity of the ending is not a flaw, but the film's final, most honest statement. Apocalypse Now is, in our view, the greatest war film ever made. War cinema at its finest does what journalism cannot. It places you inside the experience rather than beside it. and forces you to carry something of it with you when the film ends. These are our picks. Apocalypse. Now at number 1 is a choice we are confident in and fully expect to be challenged on. Saving Private Ryan's advocates have a strong case, and we would not dismiss it. Which film from this list would you have ranked first, and which would you remove entirely?